panelin dolayısıyla bizim için oldukça ilginç bir değeri var. Pozitif vortex diyorum ben daha da o etkinin artmasına. Kitapta bu sohbet var. Bugün benim için Jane'in bir ayrıca bir yeri daha var. Hemen şuradan ona bir flag out yapmak istiyorum. Jane, we look forward to hearing you speak. I am also from UC Berkeley Haas. And it's wonderful to have you. And I think the four guiding principles define how we are today in response to the threats that wait for us in the future. Dolayısıyla sevgili izleyiciler, moderatörümüze sözü devredeceğiz ki bu harika paneli bizim için yönetsin. Moderatörümüz de ev sahibimiz Harvard Business Review Türkiye Genel Yayın Yönetmeni Serdar Turan. Sevgili Serdar Turan, eğer uygunsanız günaydın.
Sevgili Aylin Itır, çok teşekkür ediyorum. Gerçekten muhteşem bir ilk gün oldu. Çok heyecanla takip ettim ben de. Çok şeyler öğrendim, çok notlar aldım. Bugün de her iki sahnede de çok mükemmel konuşmacılar, mükemmel programlar var. Sizin de enerjiniz bize de enerji veriyor. Çok teşekkürler.
Biz teşekkür ederiz. Biz teşekkür ederiz. Çok keyifliyiz. Ayrıca harika bir ekiple çalışıyoruz. Büyük şans bizim için. Teşekkürler.
Evet sevgili dostlar, değerli izleyiciler, aslında Aylin ve Itır'ın söylediği gibi içinden geçtiğimiz dönem 1+1'in 2 etmediği, çok daha fazlası etmesi gerektiği bir dönem. Şöyle bir etrafımıza baktığımızda gerek insanlık olarak, gerek çevre olarak, gerek gezegenimiz olarak, ekonomi olarak her noktada ciddi kötücül sorunlarla karşı karşıyayız. Ve bu kötücül sorunların çözümü için artık tek bir kişinin, tek bir şirketin, tek bir endüstrinin, tek bir ülkenin gücünün yetmeyeceğini hepimiz biliyoruz. Artık ortak akla, artık ortak enerjiye, artık işbirliğine ihtiyacımız var. Yeri geldiğinde rakiplerin bile işbirliği içinde olduğu, ekosistemlerin, platformların ön plana çıktığı, aslında bütünün, bileşenin toplamından çok daha fazlası olması gerektiği bir döneme doğru giriyoruz. Böyle bir dönemde liderlik kavramı da çok önemli değişimler, dönüşümler yaşıyor. Daha 1960'lardan gelen o komanda ve kontrol tarzı liderliğin bugün artık çok daha hizmet edici liderliğe, çok daha yol açıcı liderliğe, çok daha işbirliği ortaya koyucu, orkestre edici liderliğe doğru evrildiğini biz de uzun süredir yazıyoruz, çiziyoruz. Bugün işte bu konuda çok değerli katkılar veren, hem akademik anlamda hem pratik anlamda bu konuya çok önemli katılımlarda bulunan çok değerli bir isimle karşı karşıyayız. Çok değerli bir ismi bugün ağırlayacağız. Sevgili Jane Wei Skiller.
Hello.
Hi Jane.
Hi.
Welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. I really appreciate the gracious and warm welcome. It's an honor to join you all today. So I'm thrilled to be here.
It's a pleasure to host you, Jane, and I really appreciate your time today because I'm a big fan of your work. And we have been talking so much about the change or the development in leadership concept. We have been talking about wicked problems, and we know that we need to collaborate more and more. We need to create more and more shared value in order to cope with all those ongoing changes and in order to come over these challenges. So I know that you are really doing a great job of putting some work and some juice in it. But despite all high hopes and hard work and significant investments, we have been seeing that social sector is still facing many shortcomings, and the pace of the progress is not at a pace which we expect it to be. So I think there are lots of things to do, but leadership is the crucial part of this element. So having said that, without any further ado, I would like to leave the floor to you for your presentation, and then we will be digging down with some further questions. So
Sounds great.
The floor is yours,
Thank
Jane.
you. Thank you, Serdar. So let me just share my screen and then I will get started. So often social impact work can feel like this, where it's a huge problem relative to the scale of the resources that we control or lead or manage. And I hear this time and time again from social sector leaders of all stripes. And what I've found from the research that I've done is really alternative is really looking to others and seeing what your strengths are and also exploring what others can add to increase and generate the synergies that can get to greater impact. So I promise that these ideas that I'm sharing with you today are not ideas I've dreamt up alone, sitting in the ivory tower. It is really grounded in field-based research, learning from practitioners, from leading-edge networks that have achieved tremendous impact, and trying to understand what makes these networks work. why are some networks able to achieve tremendous gains in mission impact while other networks simply become just a series of seemingly endless committee meetings? And so I really sought to try to understand what was the difference between these types of networks and began to see a really interesting pattern. So across a range of different issue areas, everything from economic development, job creation, to social services, to environmental conservation and climate change, education, housing, the arts, and numerous other case studies. And even now, every time I meet a new social impact leader that's been working with network leadership, there's new lessons that come out from all of these, but they're the same sets of ideas of what's at the core of what's making their network succeed. So even though these networks might take different forms, they might be large or small, they might be bilateral or multilateral, they share a fundamental set of principles in common. And that I see time and time again across all of these different examples in different fields. So these 4 principles are really what are at the core of successful networks and leadership in networks and social impact work. And the first is absolutely without question a focus on the mission even before the organization. That is, it's the engine that's driving the work is really the focus on the mission rather than how do I grow my organization more and more and more without regard to what's happening beyond the organization growth and scale and program expansion. And this leads to different ways of working. For example, some organizations might seek out former competitors and work with them and maybe even share some proprietary knowledge that they have that one might think is proprietary, but in social impact work, so often it would be a good thing if someone were to take your great ideas and replicate them and scale them and grow them even without your ongoing intervention. So things like sharing their expertise or even fundraising on behalf of a peer organization, or in some cases, I've even heard of organizations that have redirected funding to a peer organization because they might have had a funder that said, we would like you to create a program in this area. And the social impact organization would say, well, that's not actually our expertise, but we know of an organization that does this and does it well, and they're very complementary to our work. So why don't you support that work in our peer organization? And they'll actually direct funding to their peer. And again, that may seem counterintuitive, but it advances the mission. The next idea is a focus on trust rather than control. So the core of everything is that there's a key emphasis on a relational foundation, shared values, and a trust that is reciprocated amongst the participants in the network. And even though you might have contracts, you might have MOUs, you might have formal accountability systems, the reality is what makes the network tick is this basis of trust, and that's fundamental, is an emphasis on the norm of humility rather than self-promotion. And I've seen this again in so many instances where there was an opportunity for a leader or the organization to be in the limelight and gain recognition. And the organization, for example, in the case of Habitat for Humanity in Egypt, when they built 6,000 houses in 6 years, and this was record-breaking across Habitat for Humanity International's nearly 100 programs. At the 6,000th house celebration, Yusri Makar, who was the president of Habitat for Humanity at the time, was invited to take the stage. And he went up on stage and said, "This isn't Habitat. We're simply providing support," and brought all of his peer network partners on stage to join and share in that recognition. So that emphasis of lifting up all boats and focusing on how to advance the network as a whole rather than how do I be the leader and the dominant player in the field. Finally, the last point is this concept of building constellations rather than being the brightest star. And again, this ties right in with the point of humility, is that those who really focus on the network mindset think of their work not just as a single engine to get to mission impact. So the first graphic, and you don't have to get your eyes examined, you don't need to actually see all of the text in detail. I just wanted to put these two slides together so you could see the contrast between an organization-centric mindset, which is in the left slide, which is, for example, Habitat for Humanity in the middle, and then all of the various stakeholders it works with: civic organizations, education, churches, fraternal organizations, businesses, all of the organizations it partners with arrayed around it. In contrast, the concept of building constellations is is shelter and affordable housing is at the core. The mission is at the middle, and Habitat for Humanity is one of many players within that field. And there are all those same organizations arrayed around it, but there's no dominant organization. There's no dominant model. There's no dominant programmatic approach. It really is the network is going to activate the relevant resources to get the most traction on the mission. And they allocate those activities according to what's going to serve the mission most effectively. So you can see the 4 principles are actually quite simple. They focus on mission before organization, an emphasis on trust rather than control, emphasizing the norm of humility, brand promotion and self-promotion, and finally seeking to build constellations rather than stars. So those are the 4 principles in a nutshell. They're quite simple. And I think what's quite phenomenal is that they're very simple, yet they're challenging because they run counter to so much of what we see in the world. Frankly, there's typically a very competitive environment where organizations are trying to outcompete each other and grow at all costs. There's an emphasis on kind of top-down controls, and you need to promote yourself like crazy, even in the social impact space, in order to attract funding, in order to attract talent. And then finally, so often there's been this dominant model in the social impact space of the social entrepreneur as hero. They have a silver bullet solution. They simply need the resources to grow, to scale, and they're going to solve this problem single-handedly. That model has been so dominant that it's really shaped and influenced a lot of the behavior in the philanthropic sector, in the social impact space. And so we have to kind of break old habits in order to get to really opening the floodgates for network leadership and network leaders and getting to the scale of impact through these more collaborative approaches. So that is why I do the work that I do, is that I want to share what I've learned as a researcher. And I'm so excited about the power of this approach and share the examples and case studies of how people have done this work and achieved great things simply because they let go of control. They invested their resources humbly and worked to build the constellations and not stars. And there's a quote that I think really captures this idea in a very brief way, which is, the leader is best when people barely know he exists. When the work is done, people will say they did it themselves. So this is from Lao Tzu in the 6th century BC. So that's all for my presentation. I'm happy to take questions and would love to have a chance to engage with the audience on that.
Great, Jane. Thank you very much for such a brief and powerful presentation. As you have mentioned, the 4 principles seems to be very simple in theory, but for practical, it is not easy to realize them or materialize them, because all of them require significant mindset shifts, mindset changes, and organizational changes as well. So let me drop down a couple of questions to this concept down a little bit. First of all, we are going through this pandemic era, and we have been talking so much about resiliency and collaboration for leadership. And resilient leadership is becoming the buzzword of the era, and lots of articles are going around this topic. So regarding this pandemic era and these 4 principles, how do these principles sound for resiliency and collaborative leadership?
Yes, so for network leadership, they can absolutely lead to more effective and more sustainable leadership, particularly in crisis situations. I would say they apply effectively even when things aren't in crisis situation. But the reason why they're so durable is because they really distribute leadership and resources and expertise and capacity throughout a network. It's not concentrated in a single entity and doesn't depend on kind of a single brain, rather spread throughout the field, through the community. And so even if one organization experiences a shock or there's a leadership change, you have all of these other leaders who can work together to fill in the gaps. So it's quite powerful inherently.
Right. How could a leader materialize these 4 pillars, Jane? Because we are talking about mission focusing, we are talking about managing by trust, promoting others, building hubs. So as we have already talked, this seems to be simple, very basic, but when it comes to practice, it requires a huge mindset shift. So what is that mindset shift, and how could leaders materialize these 4 pillars in their leadership style and daily operations?
And it is simple and easy to learn, in the sense that chances are many people are already doing their work in this way. Maybe not all of their work, but if you were to look back at what your most successful collaborations might have been historically in your own experience, what are people most proud of? What are you most proud of in your work? You will already have seen these principles in action. So I always say, I didn't invent this. This is not my idea. I learned this from studying successful collaborations. And I don't think there's ever been a single successful collaboration that I've seen that did not demonstrate these principles. So look into your own work history. What are you most proud of? And what can you learn from those lessons? And how do they differ from some of the other experiences that you've had that maybe weren't as successful? And likewise, looking externally to other people in the field that you admire that are having great impact. How are they achieving their work? What's their work style? How skillful are they at engaging with other people and bringing in people into a bigger tent to get resources mobilized toward a mission, and try to find connections with them and support them, and in turn build a collaboration. So it's really looking internally and externally for the type of people that you must be eager to work with.
The other important point is the partnership concept. You know, the heart of these four pillars are creating more and more value with collaboration. So the crucial component of this network leadership is partnership. So how could we select right partners to get the most out of this network partnership concept, Jane?
Yes, there are two key pieces of advice I would say. First is doing due diligence up front to really get a sense of what people are about, what their track record is, what their values are, what's really driving them in their work, and seeing if they have the trustworthiness to really deliver as a big contributor in a collaboration. Of course, that also involves looking in the mirror and making sure that you yourself and your organization demonstrate those principles so that you're a trustworthy partner as well. And the other is, once you do start getting into a collaboration, so often we rush into, let's get to the nuts and bolts of what needs to get done. Let's formulate the strategy, let's get the plan, and let's execute. And we don't take the time to invest in getting to know each other in a more open and authentic way of getting to know each other as human beings. What's really your passion? What's motivating you? How do you see this work? And understanding some of those complexities really does create the trust that's critical to enabling difficult conversations and working in collaboration over the long haul.
The other crucial stakeholder within this mapping is governments, I guess. And we know that the role of the government is under discussion for a while. And with the pandemic, we have been seeing a huge increase in this debate. So what would the role of the government be in the upcoming era? And how could a government body implement this network leadership concept?
Yeah, so I think perhaps if we were to look for the positive in the midst of all of the crises that the world has been experiencing in the last year or so, this is a tremendous opportunity to rethink the role of government, the way that it's traditionally operated. So instead of big infrastructure, large resource commitments, and kind of a linear way of solving or addressing a problem, is much more of an opportunity to think about how can the government, which we know, although is playing a critical role, could never be sufficient to solve these large, complex problems. We need government, we need business, we need the social sector, we need community members, we need all of these players in the room and working as equals and bringing to bear their resources on the problem. So the government really has an opportunity to play a catalytic role and say, we can provide the platform, we can provide the space, we can help with facilitation, we can help find the best that's out there in the world, in our communities, and bring them together. And that enables you to be leaner and more dynamic and find kind of emergent solutions that aren't necessarily only within kind of the minds of government leaders.
Right. I have to admit that it is not easy to transform government bodies. Maybe it's much more easier for private industry to get the most out of this transformation. And when it comes to governments, the agility is a little bit lower than the private industry. Maybe in some governments, this is not the case, but this is the conventional wisdom. So how can government bodies transform in terms of organizational structures and mindsets to cope with this network leadership concept? Yeah,
so I would say it's difficult for every type of organization to change, because I've been studying this work in nonprofits for 2 decades, and it's difficult for nonprofits to change. It's difficult for government, and likewise, you can look anywhere in the management press. It's difficult for businesses to change and turn on a dime. So I think it's maybe just people have the tendency to kind of continue with old habits without necessarily necessarily changing a kind of a 9-degree turn. I think, again, the crisis makes it where it's more urgent and more people are perhaps more open to thinking in new ways because, again, Einstein is known for saying insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results, right? And so if we want transformational change, we have to change what we're doing. If we're okay with incremental change, then yeah, sure, business as usual is fine. But I think most often we're seeing that we're falling far short of our goals on so many dimensions. That reality is perhaps a forcing mechanism. The other is, again, this isn't some very technical, complex, costly thing to implement. As I mentioned earlier in my comments, that there are likely successes in every organization, in every community, in every government agency of when they've done work really well. And they could say, this is what we're really proud of. This is what we want to have more of. How can we get more of that? And go and learn from the people who led those efforts, put them in positions of leadership, give them the resources that they need. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel and throw everything out, but rather look for where things are working, look for existing successes and the social and community capital that already exist. Because I know, for example, if I've been able to build a career of studying people who've done this over my career, there have been people who've been doing this for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so we just need to look for it and then put the energy and resources into it.
Jane, you mentioned that you did not invent these 4 pillars. You just observed them, or you just
Correct.
experienced them, or you just derived them from the practices of many, many other institutions. In
Yes.
order to make this concept more concrete, can you give us an example in which these 4 principles have been implemented successfully and that example created a huge value?
Yeah, so I'll start with the Habitat for Humanity case since I already mentioned it, and I know we're short on time. So Habitat for Humanity Egypt is one of the most successful country programs of the Habitat Global Housing Program. And Habitat's goal is to eliminate poverty housing throughout the world. And Habitat Egypt started in a very unique way in that they didn't seek to just build up their infrastructure and grow from the ground up, which was solely as a volunteer organization with a very limited budget. Instead, they said, what can we do to first find existing indigenous community-based organizations that are doing work that's related to what we're doing or even doing housing that we can support. And so they found existing community-based organizations that actually had a gap and needed support in housing, but were addressing other things such as education, economic development, health, because all of those things lead to poverty housing if you don't have adequate conditions for all of those, and said, why don't we teach you how to do housing programs? We'll give you some seed capital, we'll give you the technical expertise, and we'll support you in developing the capacity in-house in your own organizations. And that will be synergistic with what you're already doing, and you'll be better able to address your community's needs. And so they began to build a network little by little with a range of different organizations throughout the country of Egypt. And then over time, within 6 years, they became one of the most successful organizations, country programs within the Habitat Global Network by cumulative house numbers, even though they had colleagues that had been operating for decades longer than they had. And it was that network approach that enabled them to first ramp up very quickly, ramp up on a very lean budget where the return on investment for that Habitat program was the highest return on investment across all of the different global programs. And then the power of it, you asked about sustainability and durability, was the expertise was housed in the communities. It wasn't housed in Habitat, the international NGO. It was housed in the community-based organizations that were already in existence. So even if Habitat had a funding issue, that expertise was right there in the community and could continue to flourish without them. In fact, that was a very deliberate part of their network strategy.
Right. I think that's a really perfect example, Jane. It is really a good example of showing that we need something more than organizations. We need networks that is creating more and more shared value other than the organizations. Now, we have a couple of questions from the audience. Very briefly, I would like to shoot them to you. So the first question is about the concept of leadership in general, Jane. Do we need leaders? Do we need leadership? Now, we are talking about many, many different organizational models or management models as agile, lean organizations. So do you think we need leadership? Do we need to change this paradigm?
I think that this leadership is important, but it's a different style of leadership. It's not leadership where all of the qualities are inherent in a single person, but rather leadership that's, again, this concept is nothing new. Servant leadership, level 5 leadership, people who are willing to lead from behind And so a powerful leader, even the Lao Tzu quote from the 6th century, is the leader is best when people barely know he or she exists. Right. So that concept of leader just needs to change from maybe our traditional view of a very dominant, powerful single figure that is making everything happen to somebody who isn't seeking the recognition, isn't ego driven, is comfortable leading from behind, enabling and empowering others to get the work done because they see that as the most effective way to get things done. In fact, one of the network leaders I've studied is this is a very common sense way of working. It's just not common practice. And I think the conditions and the context that we operate in drive toward more traditional managerial approaches. But I think if there ever were a time where we need to let go of traditional habits and think about new ways of working, now might be that very moment. So the time is ripe.
Great. The other question is about the mistakes of today's leaders. What are some common or biggest mistakes of today's leaders? What traps do they fall regularly?
Well, I think there's a tendency, as I mentioned also, to think that you have to solve all the problems on your own, that you bear the weight of the world, or that whatever organization you're running, no matter how well resourced, it still feels like you're dwarfed by the scale of the challenge. So I think that willingness to say, I'm very good at this particular thing, but there are all these other things that I'm not good at, that I need help with, that I need to seek out that expertise, because if I don't, then the value of what I'm doing is diminished. So that ability to see the bigger picture and not just be driven by the carrots and sticks that the environment kind of lays out for us is that visionary leadership that's really important. And I think that's one thing that so inspires me in the work that I do in promoting network leadership, is that these leaders are the most visionary leaders I've ever met, because they have the ambition to actually move the needle and make a difference in the world. They're not content to say, I sit at the top of a successful organization that has a big budget, that has a big brand name, and now I've done my job. They want mission impact, and getting mission impact isn't going to be about a single individual, or about a single organization, or even a single sector. It's going to be collaboration across the community in the world that's not going to be recognizable as a single entity or leader.
Right. The other question is about the generations, different generations, Jane.
Yes.
Some research says that even in some firms today, there are more than 3-4 generations working together, and it will be 5 generations working together in a couple of years' time. So these people from different generations have different perspectives to life, different way of doing, different way of decision making. So lots of intergenerational issues going through in social and business life, if I may say. So what is your observations about these intergenerational issues? Are there some glitches between the understanding of those generations, and how can we create more collaboration between these different generations?
Well, I think I've definitely seen in my students, especially since I've been in academia for 20 years now, that the younger generations generally are more open to this way of working. I think especially maybe because they're working their way up the ladder, that they don't have preformed ways of thinking and working. I think one of the big opportunities for senior leaders is to see new ways of working as a way to get to the impact that they've wanted to get to over the course of their careers, and see these younger leaders and these new ideas and new models not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Because I think that's one of the things I've seen as a big challenge, is that even if you have really inspired network leaders, if they come into a system that just crushes them and blocks opportunity to work in this way because it doesn't fit the traditional mold, we'll still keep getting that incremental level of change, which is too slow. We all know it's too slow for the challenges that we face. So I think at the same time, within senior leadership, there are countless senior leaders, many of them that I've learned from, that are working in this way. I think they need to share their wisdom and share their experience of what made the difference, and show the younger generation that it's not just about being at the helm of an organization and getting the recognition, but rather building the field and investing in others in order to get to that mission impact. And the value of that is being really symbolic of great leaders, not just gaining recognition for yourself.
Right. Jane, last but not least, Thomas Piketty, in his really very tremendous book, Capital for the 21st Century, mentions the 30 years after the World War as golden 30 years, because throughout these 30 years, there has been a huge increase in pace of innovation, in pace of social values, in pace of humanitarian values. And he mentions that the reason of this high level progress is a system built after all this collapse, and the system is based on human values and innovation. So now we are about to come to an era that we have a chance to rebuild lots of the business systems that we have been going with. And the pillars of this change is crucial. So I don't want to bring a very ambitious argument here, but the world order is about to change. So what's your perspective about the main change in the global business and social perspective, and how these four pillars may help leaders to streamline this change?
I think a key focus needs to be building and rebuilding community. I think that relationship amongst people is the most essential thing that has led to a lot of the problems that we're seeing in the world. So building that interconnectivity amongst community members and between the sectors, amongst the sectors, between business and their community. So they're not these disconnected, very arm's length transactional relationships, but rather much closer, tighter, local community building, I think, is really what's going to make a difference in the world going forward.
Jane, thank you very much for this really fruitful and perfect conversation, if I may say. As you have mentioned, the four pillars are really very important to reinvent the future that we would like to have. I think for the last century, we are at a pace or at a point that we can influence the change that is going through with this collaborative and share value approach. So thank you very much for bringing or shedding a light to that concept with these four pillars.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you. Sevgili dostlar, değerli izleyiciler, Jane Wayne-Skilleren'ı ağırladık. Bugün gerçekten de ortaya koyduğu 4 prensip basit gibi gözükse de hayata geçirmesi anlamında hiç de o kadar kolay olmayan, çok ciddi kafa yapısı, bakış açısı ve sistem değişikliği gerektiren bir modeli adresliyor. Ama bunları da hayata geçirdiğimizde gerçekten o hayalini kurduğumuz gerek non-profit dünyada gerek özel sektörde değişimin, dönüşümün şekillendirme gücünün de çok fazla olduğunu görüyoruz. Bugünlük bizden bu kadar sevgili dostlar.